You're listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks, your source for centered and focused play therapy coaching.
Hi, I'm Dr. Brenna Hicks, the Kid Counselor. This is the Play Therapy Podcast where you get a masterclass in child-centered play therapy and practical support and application for your work with children and their families. In today's episode, we are doing another Session Savvy series, and this one is on the use of the word silly in the playroom. But before I get into that, I wanted to remind you, these weeks, this last week and this week are pre-recorded because I am in Australia presenting at the conference. So sorry, I know you're used to more, but you'll have your regularly scheduled programming back soon. Okay. The use of the word silly in the playroom. We as adults tend to view certain types of behavior, the way children say certain things, do certain things, or behave or act, we refer to it as silly sometimes. It's usually when it's playful. It's usually when it's energetic. It's usually when kids are giggly. It's usually when kids are a little bit wild and rambunctious. We tend to say, oh, you're being silly, or you think that's silly, something along those lines. All right, so here's the session savvy component. Silly is a word that usually has a connotation. And we have to be really careful when we use words that a child might already have an association or context for that word in mind. In other words, if the only time they hear the word silly is at school, for example, and if a teacher says, you all need to stop being silly, that's very clearly a negative context. Being silly is bad and you need to stop. Or if at home, the only time the child hears the word silly is if a parent says, you always act silly when you're tired, and I know that means that it's bedtime. Now, all of a sudden, it's associated with being tired and fatigue, and therefore it's a negative trait. And there are a lot of words that fall into this category, by the way, but I'm focusing specifically on silly because it has come up a lot in the collective. It's come up a lot on coaching calls, and I've seen it in several of the play session videos that I've been reviewing too. So here's what I'd like y'all to keep in mind. Any word that we mean innocently, we might say it with positive intentions, actually. In our minds, silly might be playful and fun and lighthearted. But that is a word that can be loaded to a child. And we have no idea and no way to know what context the child might have already heard that word. And so therefore, it's very easy for a child to misinterpret the meaning of a statement like that. So to avoid these types of words where we say it and it could be misperceived, we want to stick to narrative commentary or tracking behavior. So instead of saying, oh, you're being silly, we say what the child's actually doing. You're giggling, or you're running all around the room with your arms in the air, or something along those lines. We want to be very specific about behavior because that is not misinterpretable. That's just statement of fact, what you're seeing with your eyes, what you're experiencing in the playroom in the moment with the child. There's no context that can be misconstrued there. So your goal is to narrate what is happening or track behavior in very simple, basic observational terms. Because often what will also happen is a therapist will, as the child is laughing, for example, therapist will say, you think that's silly. Again, silly is very relative. What you think silly means, I'm going to think a different definition of silly, and therefore the child will as well. And so you think that's silly, you feel silly, you're acting silly. Just be mindful of words like that can be perceived based on experience and based on the way that the child has internalized the meaning of that. So your antidote is track behavior and give narrative commentary. All right, before I sign off, actually two things. I was going to say one more thing, but two things. If you haven't already, please go to playtherapypodcast.com and sign up for my newsletter. I try to send one out once a week. I'm not always completely on track and schedule with that. Sometimes there's 1 or 2 week gaps, but I try to be about every week, but you can expect probably at least 2 a month. I would say that's a safe bet. So I probably should be more diligent on that. I'm sorry for all of my newsletter people. I do have a lot going on. So not that that's an excuse. It's just sometimes the podcast is a priority. So I suppose, there's a hierarchy here. But if you haven't already, sign up for my newsletter. You'll get emails about all things CCPT, my thoughts, my random ponderings, whatever's stirring in my head and heart, you'll get to know about it. And so many of you respond, for those of you who are podcast listeners and email newsletter subscribers, so many of you respond and share your thoughts with me in response to those emails. So I really appreciate that. And you can do the same. And if you haven't signed up, please do so. Oh, and if you want to reach out to me, Brenna at thekidcounselor.com. I think I've said that about 1,000 times though, so you probably know that. Okay, before we sign off, I want to read, I've done this before. One of the coaching participants and collective members and podcast listener, probably an email subscriber too, I don't know, Nathan, he does a monthly reflection on a specific child or a specific session, and he has sent a few to me over the course of the year or so that I've known him. And I wanted to read this one to you all. He gave me permission to do so. I wanted to read this to you all because if this doesn't really encapsulate what the child-centered way of being is and how kids conquer what they need to work on in the playroom, I don't know any other thing that could articulate this better. So I want to share this with you. He's talking about a client named Amy, and that's not her actual name. But I just want to read you his reflection of the month so that we can all not only celebrate the work that he and Amy are doing together, but also the beauty and the power of CCPT together. Sometimes play therapy interactions can look very ordinary and trivial from the outside. A child challenging me to a game of Uno or drawing something on the whiteboard is not self-evidently meaningful if you have no context of their emotional development and healing. However, there are certain interactions that are so full of symbolism, even a totally uneducated person would understand something profound is happening. This is perhaps most often the case when a child uses baby dolls in her play. There's something emotionally visceral about relating to the likeness of a baby, and when the child brings out the bottle next, the invocation of this universal symbol of nurturing grabs my attention like a steel vise. In one such session, a little girl, who I will call Amy, put 2 dolls in my arms, demanding that I try to feed them. She told me that they were crying and directed me to comfort them, then immediately told me they could never be comforted. With the 2 inconsolable babies in my lap, she walked to the toy cupboard and put on a policeman costume. She returned to the sofa with handcuffs, told me I was under arrest for being a bad father. This was not the first time she had placed toy infants in my arms, but where previous failed father interactions were somewhat ambiguous, the full force of her moral condemnation suddenly manifested with a shocking clarity. The very next week, in a routine parent session, Amy's mother told me for the first time that Amy's father had a drug problem when Amy was a baby, and due to his drug abuse, he severely neglected her care throughout her infancy. I was asked once whether CCPT is easier than other forms of therapy. That was difficult to answer. I love this method, but how do you express the, quote, difficulty level of playing the tragically negligent father as his hatefully tormented daughter experiences him? How do I express the challenge of being the only person in the world to participate in the subjective recreation of this innocent little girl's most profound suffering? The heartbreaking moments of my week often come from the helpless feelings that accompany such sessions. I partook in the reality of Amy's innermost pain, and after her session, I was left alone in a small room full of scattered toys and tortured memories. However, Amy was not done playing. As time passed, she used the playroom to begin integrating the shattered fragments of her neglect story. Trauma experts will tell you that when a traumatized person puts his story together, integrating it creatively into a kind of narrative wholeness, he begins to assemble the broken shards of his being. At times, Amy punished and re-educated me, as she cast me in the role of her father. She sent me to school to learn how to take care of babies. At other times, she took on the role of nurturing, feeding me the finest foods imaginable, made of the most precious gold. Still other times, she struggled between her punitive impulses and her feelings of goodwill, throwing piles of fake money angrily at my feet. Then one day, something happened that strikes me as nothing less than a miracle. Having placed 2 baby dolls in my arm, Amy brandished a magical wooden wand with obvious delight in her eyes. She waved the wand at the dolls and yelled, "Heavy," then watched as I struggled to lift the tiny, fragile bodies of those babies in my arms. She made my hands heavy and then my arms heavy, watching as my body slumped further and further down. She aimed the point of the wand directly at my chest and said, "Your heart is heavy." To obey her direction, I bent over double in my chair with my face close to the ground. I found myself playing the bearer of unthinkable betrayal against an innocent girl, prostrating before her. Then it happened. She sprayed the top of my head with water from a squirt gun. She giggled. It occurred to me at that moment that she had achieved the thing that every hurt person needs to achieve, whether or not their pain qualifies as traumatic. She turned the hideous monstrosity of her hidden pain into something she could look at, and lo, she was not at all afraid. In some sense, child-centered play therapy is like most heartfelt relationships that really matter. It carries on in the most natural and breezy state of whimsy, and occasionally bursts into sudden fits of titanic emotional gravity. It is easy, in the sense that it does not demand the concentrated mental effort needed to solve an algebraic equation, nor does it require the kind of physical effort needed by construction workers who slog their heavy burdens in the wee hours of the morning. However, this kind of work requires the honesty and vulnerability needed to be ushered into the inner sanctuary of a child's life. For me personally, there are few things in this world so dangerous as that. However, the hazards are paid for in full when a child calls forth the demons of her tortured past, humbles them to the ground, looks them fully in the face, and greets their hideous presence with a lilting laughter. All right. Thank you, Nathan, for writing that. Thank you for expressing that, and thank you for giving me permission to share it. I hope that that encourages you. I hope it reminds you of the incredible gift and blessing and honor it is to do what we do and to be in moments like that in play sessions as kids heal. Love y'all. We'll talk again soon. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks. For more episodes and resources, please go to www.playtherapypodcast.com.